Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to oped.tv. My guest and I are going to take a look at the media coverage of Donald Trump and his administration. It's an administration that has demonstrated time and again its utter contempt for the truth, for the rule of law, and even for common human decency. How do you cover that kind of administration? How do you let the American people know truly what is at stake and how profoundly dangerous this moment is? And how do we in the mainstream press and other media outlets let our young people know that the behavior of the president and his administration is not normal and should not be tolerated? I'm fortunate to have as my guest the perfect person to talk with about all of this. He's Eric Alterman, an historian, a journalist, a distinguished professor of English at our own Brooklyn College, and the former media columnist for The Nation magazine. Eric, welcome. Thanks for coming in.
The former Eric Alterman.
The former Eric Alterman. My personal opinion is that the press writ large has not done a good job covering Trump and his policies and his behavior. Obviously, there are a lot of superb journalists doing a lot of hard work on this issue, and a lot of them are at my old newspaper, the New York Times. But overall, the coverage has been, in my view, substandard. What's your take on how the coverage has been?
Well, I have to say, I think Donald Trump is so horrible in so many different ways that the people covering him, number one, they can't get a handle on it. But number two, they're kind of afraid to admit what is actually happening. They feel a need to sweeten it. That's why we have the term sane washing.
Right.
Trump says completely bizarre things that make no sense at all, that have enormous costs, and they can't bring themselves to actually just quote his words, or to explain that what he's talking about has already been disproven and he's been saying it for years and it's never been true, and they're afraid of the context that would give people an idea of just the enormous danger we're in.
One of the big failures, I think, is that we have not properly shown how much terrible damage, how much harm to human beings that Trump's policies are doing to people. I'm talking, for example, about families devastated by his economic policies and by his health care policies, the cutbacks in health care and that sort of thing. There's all kinds of examples. These are the kinds of stories that really just require legwork. You could go out and talk to these families and show in a very dramatic fashion what's happening. But even that is not happening. Why not?
Number one, there is a organized protest movement every time a mainstream media organization prints something in conflict with what people on the right would like to believe. That is consistently reinforced. Used to just say by Fox, but now there's an entire ecosystem of right-wing reinforcement. Under Trump, we have something new, which is physical threats. People are afraid for their persons, for their lives, for their families, for their houses. We've heard a lot about this with judges, but it's true of journalists also.
Which, by the way, is a story in itself that should be getting tremendous coverage. But go ahead.
And the third thing is, historically, the way that your colleagues at the New York Times, and the New York Times sets the tone for all elite coverage, did a story was they made friends with their sources. They worked them for years. They got inside information. They quoted what their sources were saying. Then they went to the other side and said, what's your view? And the other side would say, we disagree. And then that would be the story. But if your sources are completely divorced from reality, who are saying things that make no sense at all and are like contradicted by your very eyes, and then you go to the other side and you quote them because they are the cabinet secretaries or the leaders of the House or whatever, and then you go to the other side says, no, I don't agree with that. How are you supposed to make up your mind, if you're just a reader? I used to use this example when I was talking about Joe McCarthy. Joe McCarthy would say, this guy's a communist. And then they would go to the guy and say, are you a communist? The junior senator from Wisconsin says you are. And he'd go, no, I'm not. And then the reader was somehow supposed to decide if the guy was a communist. Well, now that's the coverage about absolutely everything. And the man making the accusation, I mean, McCarthy was a drunk and he was irresponsible, but Trump is like 100 McCarthys in one on every single issue.
Right. The Trump's decision to cut down U.S. To basically eliminate USAID, the Agency for International Development, has caused a profound human catastrophe. According to Harvard School of Public Health, the cutoff of this aid has already led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, many of them children. My friend Nick Kristof at the Times has done wonderful work on this stuff. He's been great. But if you're talking about the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, there should be massive coverage of a story like that. If the Strait of Hormuz is shut down, that's all we hear day after day after day. But hundreds of thousands dead. I understand what you're saying about the difficulty of covering some of these issues, but what would the news executives tell us? What would their line be if they were asked why they're not covering such a horrendous story as the consequences of the USAID cuts?
Well, number one, it's expensive. The Washington Post, as we all know, just decimated its foreign bureau. Number two, there's the old adage, if I get run over by a car in front of my house, that's news. If the further away you are, the less newsy it is. So you need
one person dies, it's
700
a story.
people.
If 1,000 people die,
right.
it's old news.
But also, journalists like to. What's the hook? I mean, journalists like to have sort of a counterintuitive hook. So Trump is killing people that his movement doesn't care about. That's not interesting. What's interesting is when Trump does something that might get Nick Fuentes mad, that might get Tucker Carlson mad.
Right.
That's the story. Conflict is the story. There isn't any conflict because these people don't have anyone to speak up for them. I happen to know a little something about this. My daughter works for a global NGO, and she just had her health care payments go up by 70%. And I said to her, and she gets paid very little. And I said to her, well, they're going to lose people because everyone whose health care payments is going up is taking an enormous pay cut.
Right.
And she goes, Dad, everyone else in this field was funded by AID. People are desperate to work here. They can cut pay as much as they want, and they'll still have plenty of people. So this whole thing, I mean, you can argue a lot about American imperialism and whether or not we were forced for good or bad in this particular conflict and that particular thing. But no one really had a problem with our helping improve the health of the rest of the world with our wonderful advantages. And yet, didn't save any money. Just it's cruelty, as I forget who said this, but it's cruelty for cruelty's sake.
Yep.
It's like Kristi Noem shooting her dog. She thought that was something that people would appreciate because these people think cruelty is something to be admired.
I know there have been profound technological changes in our society over, the past half century or so, and obviously it affects the news gathering operations. But it's not just technological change. There have been also what I think of as equally profound philosophical changes in our approach to news coverage and what's seen even by the major outlets as what's a good news story or how you should cover it. There used to be bureaus not just all over the United States but all over the world. Reporters had beats. It took a long time to become a columnist. You couldn't go to work at a newspaper and immediately become a columnist. You had to have a track record of covering.
Much less be asked to take over CBS News.
Much less. Thank you. Talk a little bit. Your perspective is better than anyone I know. Talk a little bit about the way our approach to news coverage has changed over the past 50 or so years.
Well, you're right to bring up the technological changes. And the technological changes, which basically mean, for our purposes, the internet, that's the one we're dealing with today. What they mean for journalism is that the advertising basis that funded journalism in the past is gone, because there's much more efficient ways to advertise.
Daily News was fat
Right.
when I went to the Daily
Right.
News. Yeah.
With department store ads, and there's not that many department stores anymore. Anyway,
The Times was fat with help wanted ads.
Right.
Yeah.
people were desperate to advertise. In those days, the New Yorker's biggest problem was how to fill the space in between the ads. They were making so much money. That's not the case anymore. The New York Times, about 5 years ago, became more dependent on subscription income than
Yeah.
advertising income for the first time ever.
Yeah.
So the news people have to make money from their consumers rather than do what they think is right because they've got this cushion of advertising, and things have to earn out. And what earns out? Gossip earns out, sports earns out, but the kind of news that makes you a good citizen, that tells you what your leaders are doing and who you should vote for and what's happening in places you can't see, that's not profitable news.
Right.
And that, I mean, the Times, I could go on and on about all the problems with the Times. They're the worst sane watchers in the business. I would fire the entire headline writing operation of that newspaper. But they are committed to doing really good, expensive news reporting all around the world that is almost disappearing.
I was just going to say, whatever the problems are at the Times is still your essential newspaper, and even more so given you mentioned what's happened at the Washington Post, for example. If you want to know what's going on in the world, you really need to read the New York Times.
And the Guardian.
But Americans are not reading
It's true. You need to read the New York Times.
You have to read the New York Times.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. Now, there's a big problem here that I was just about to get to, which is that the other thing the internet has done, besides take away the ads, or as a product of that, is destroy local journalism.
Right.
Craigslist began it, but it's still so.
Which, by the way, is the way most reporters got their start.
Right. So now the situation is that, first of all, the New York Times has approximately 7% of all the editorial employees in the United States, and the local journalists that connected communities and did reporting on local corruption and made people feel like they knew what was happening around them. Those have been decimated to the degree that, I mean, the papers are closing all the time, and there's no alternative media like there used to be when I was growing up and got my start. But people are much more reliant on national news, and national news, again, is understood to be this conflict between the right, which is MAGA, and the left, which is not MAGA.
Right.
And that's all there is.
So there we are.
Yeah.
Which means basically, the whole point of a free press is you're going to keep the electorate well informed, and in fact, we're not keeping the electorate well
I mean, there's
informed.
still, because of this beat section, also because of the way, particularly the New York Times, but also the networks see themselves, they feel they need to pay heed to the office of the President of the United States. So even though we know that in Trump's first term, when he was, practically Cicero compared to who he is now, he told 33,000 falsehoods. So they know that he's, and you can read in the editorial page by the editors, the main editors, saying, we know that Trump lies all the time. But in the news pages, you don't know that Trump is lying when he says this. They quote the president in a straightforward way. And the part of the reason is that that's how they've always seen their relationship to power. But part of the reason is what I said earlier, is that they're terrified of the reaction of the 70 million people who voted for Trump, who to tell them, you voted for a lunatic. You voted for someone who if he were working for Vladimir Putin, it wouldn't make any difference. You wouldn't see any difference in how he behaves. You voted for someone who if you found out that he was hired to destroy the United States of America and everything that's decent about it, you would say, now I understand. And they can't, again, they can't face up to that.
You're anticipating my next question. Trump is obviously not a reasonable, rational, intelligent, or thoughtful man. And you've mentioned a couple of times his cognitive difficulties, and I think any normal person can just look at his behavior and tell that that has to be the case. You don't have to be any kind of professional. And yet this is a man with such immense power, it's frightening, who can start and has started, a war, who has the power to launch nuclear weapons and that sort of thing. And I don't think that this is an easy kind of story to cover. But I think it is such an important story. It's so important to pound the table on this and have the people of America understand what kind of person is leading the country and what the potential consequences are. So my question to you is, what thoughts do you have about how you might approach covering that kind of story? I mean, what's your lead? And also, how do you keep that story going? Because it's the kind of story that needs to have legs. Do you have any thoughts about it?
Well, I'm called a journalist, as you just called me. I never thought of myself as a journalist, but I'm called a journalist and I'm also an academic. And I've always felt there was a conflict between these two ways of looking at the world. The most insulting thing you can say about a story in a newspaper is that, well, it's just plain academic. And the most insulting thing you say to an academic is
journalism.
You're just doing journalism. In fact, I was rejected from a program in graduate school that I wanted to go to because the man who I wanted to study with said to me, Eric, they call me a journalist around here. It'll be even worse for you. You can't come here. He did me a favor. So the point is that my whole life I've been writing now, not as long as you, but a long time, 40 years. And because I live in these two worlds simultaneously, I'm always trying to argue for more context in journalism. But context is considered academic. What happened yesterday? I mean, Trump is a genius, let's face it, he's a genius. And he's a genius because he knows what will work for reporters for this particular news cycle, which might only be a half an hour long. But he knows how to control the news cycle, and he knows that what he said yesterday is irrelevant to what he's going to say today. And he also knows that they are very reluctant to call him on anything.
He's actually losing that edge.
He gets a question and he says, "You're stupid, you're ugly, you're fat." The other journalists don't say, "Mr. President, this is no way to talk to a journalist."
Which is outrageous.
Yes, they just go on to the next question. There's one story that I could give you a lot of these, but here's one that I think is illustrative. I've been working on a long article about Antifa. And back last year, Trump was watching Fox News about riots against ICE, about violence related to ICE. That was what the story was. There wasn't any violence to speak of. What there was Fox News showing tapes of something that had happened a year earlier, because they didn't have anything now. The police weren't even called for the incident that they were talking about outside an ICE facility. But Trump was half paying attention, watching Fox News, and he announced he was going to send in U.S. troops the next day to an American city. It's a very profound thing to do. It's happened very few times in our history. Why did it happen? Because this doddering old guy was watching this news station that doesn't care anything at all about the truth.
That's the kind of behavior that is insane.
Yes, and you can apply that. I can pick any number of cases. He destroyed the U.S. wind power industry. Why? Do you know why? Do you know what he has against wind?
Tell me.
He got into a fight with the people. He owns a golf course in Scotland. He's got his name on it, and they were building wind turbines around it. It was destroying the views of the golf. And so ever since then, he's been on like a jihad against wind power. So at cost of billions of dollars and considerable pollution to replace it, he canceled all the contracts that the U.S. government had for wind power in this term. And I mean, really, you never heard that before, right?
No, I actually, that I didn't know. What I have heard is all the nonsensical, mad things he's been saying about wind.
Right, so
which is more evidence of his
but what
cognitive
I'm saying is,
decline.
Isn't that scary? that this guy is making
Oh, I'm
this
already
policy.
scared.
No, but I'm saying, I can tell you, I mean, I don't know everything. I actually kind of live in a bubble where I try to keep the guy out of my head as much as possible. But I could tell you stories about almost any one of his policies that are just as ridiculous as that. And the media they can't bear to report
These
it.
should be news stories, and they should be doing segments on it night after night, and it should be on the national news, and it should be on the local news, and it should be pounded into everybody's head until it's understood that this guy is as out of it as he is.
Well, let me ask you a question. How do you see the reward system in journalism having changed since you were a daily reporter, or just talking to your colleagues as a columnist? How do you see how the difference, the way they see their jobs today than back then?
But it's completely different. I mean, I think the standards have absolutely collapsed. I think that your description of it earlier in the program is exactly what has happened. So now you have to make money off of the news. Before 60 Minutes, for example, you know, you would have like the news would come on at 6:15 or 6:30 in the evening. You know, they didn't have to turn a profit.
Right.
The networks had an obligation to provide public service. You know, but 60 Minutes, became a bonanza, and then, people, the network chiefs found out that you could make money off of the news. And then for all the reasons that you described, it turns out that newspapers and local television stations and that sort of thing have to make money off the news. News has to not only carry its own weight, it has to turn a profit. And then, as you pointed out, you have to then get viewers or readers, and so you go for, I don't know, the lowest common denominator,
Right.
whatever,
Well, right now, we're living in sort of the worst of all possible worlds in terms of news consumption, because social media does two things. Number one, it significantly reduces one's attention span, and things are complicated.
Yeah.
Second is...
Which fights against the context that you rightly said we should have when we're covering these stories.
But second of all, for people like my daughter's generation, they get all their news from social media, and they don't know where it's coming from.
Right.
So bad news, and now with AI, we haven't mentioned AI, but bad news and false news is indistinguishable on the internet from well-sourced news.
Right.
So good money drives out bad money, and there's no profit in getting to the truth.
Right.
So the third thing, this is important too, is that there's been this 50, 60-year onslaught against the so-called liberal media by the right, beginning with the Lewis Powell memo that helped inspire the right. And now we're seeing the same thing with academia. But the idea of truth being the enemy of the ideology of the conservative movement, as the conservative movement moved further and further right, has very much diminished the respect that journalists get, academics too, in society. And journalism was never a well-paying field, particularly except at the very, very top.
Right.
So you got paid in respect. You got paid in talking to interesting people and having an interesting life. And now they're like at the very bottom. They're like of how the public sees them. So the pay is worse than ever, and the respect is worse than ever. And it's not going to attract the kind of people we need to play the role that journalism is supposed to play in democracy.
We've only got a couple minutes left, and we've been dealing with facts so far, but now we're going to go into the realm of fantasy a little bit. Given the current situation in the United States as it is, as we've been describing it, what would your priorities be if you were put in charge of a major newspaper or television network now? Assume that for the purposes of our argument that money is not a problem. What would you require your employees to do? How would you set your standards? And what are the kinds of things you'd like to cover?
Well, I mean, I would love to have this problem.
I bet.
I think ProPublica does a pretty good job of throwing, I mean, I know people are on strike now, so there's something going on, but they do a pretty good job of finding problems that are going undiscussed and and giving people the time and money to really explain them at great length, and then trying to find where to publish them, because you can't publish this kind of thing in very many places. But look, there's two things going on in this country. I mean, Catholic voters are the swing voters in almost all national elections. Donald Trump, the day before we're taping this, was attacking the Pope. What the hell? I mean, ever since Donald Trump came onto the scene in that debate on Fox, we've all been saying, okay, now people are going to wake up and realize this man shouldn't be within 100 miles of power. And yet he keeps doing things that make it, that somehow he keeps going and keeps doing them. And he keeps surviving. So what you're asking me is kind of impossible for me to answer, because as I said, there are so many things that are beyond belief. I mean, I recently became director of a new center called the Nexus Center for Anti-Semitism Research. So we're dealing with a situation on US campuses where Trump, in the name of fighting anti-Semitism, is destroying decades worth of medical research and scientific research, and saying that he's protecting Jews on campus. And that's how he's doing it, by destroying these jobs, by destroying the American education system that has been the most valuable thing for any Jewish community in all of history. So how are you supposed to cover that? Well, the New York Times is always saying, Mr. Trump, in his effort to fight anti-Semitism, doing this, but it's nothing about anti-Semitism.
It's not about anti-Semitism.
He's using this excuse of anti-Semitism to destroy his ideological enemies.
Yep.
And I would, if I were in charge of a news organization, the one thing I would not do is I would not frame any stories according to the narrative given to me by these liars, by these crazy people. I would be fully independent and take whatever hits I needed to take.
Yep.
And that would be a great newspaper.
We're going to have to stop there. We could go on for another hour. Eric Alterman, thank you so much for coming in. I appreciate it. Thank you all for watching. I appreciate that too. I'm Bob Herbert, and we'll see you next time.